One of the aspects of the 9/11 anniversary seldom mentioned anymore is the follow-up episode of letters containing a weaponized form of anthrax to various media outlets and legislators. 5 people died as a result, and the scare had been used, at least temporarily, to ramp up support both for the USA PATRIOT Act as well as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. One person who has returned our focus to the anthrax attacks is Graeme Macqueen. Professor Graeme Macqueen received his PhD in Buddhist studies from Harvard University and taught in the Religious Studies Department of McMaster University for 30 years. While at McMaster, he became founding director of the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster University, after which he helped develop the BA program in peace studies and oversaw the development of peace-building projects in Sri Lanka, Gaza, Croatia, and Afghanistan. Graeme Macqueen was a member of the organizing committee of the Toronto hearings held on the 10th anniversary of 9/11 and is co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies. He is the author of the 2014 book, The 2001 Anthrax Deception, The Case for a Domestic Conspiracy, published by Clarity Press, and this book will be the focus of our interview. The author joins us by Skype from Hamilton. Good afternoon, Professor Macqueen.
Hello, it's good to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you. Could you maybe inform our listeners, what is it that caught your eye about the anthrax attacks that you sought to make it the focus of your book?
Well, first of all, I had been studying the so-called 9/11 attacks for some years, and I knew they were a fraud, and I thought, oh my God, this is really important, but now I'm hearing stuff about the anthrax attacks. I'm hearing that that the anthrax in those letters came from inside the U.S. military-industrial complex. And I had read this in other people's, articles and so on, and I thought, wait a minute, if that's true, that's really important. So I thought, I'm retired and I have the good fortune to be able to take time off when I want to. So I just cleared the desk and said, I'm going to look into the anthrax attacks and find out at least what the basic facts are about them. And I quickly confirmed that, yes, it's true. They were a fraud. They were blamed on Al-Qaeda and Iraq. And in fact, the spores were traced to a U.S. military lab, that is to say, a lab serving the U.S. military and intelligence communities. So I thought, as I looked further, I found something else that I hadn't known before, and that is that there was overlapping personnel in the two attacks, in the 9/11 attacks and in the anthrax attacks. Some of the same guys, namely the so-called hijackers, showed up in both. And somehow that had escaped my attention before. So then I thought, well, wait a minute, this is extremely important, because if the anthrax attacks are provably a fraud, right? If they provably came from within the U.S. military-industrial complex, and if they have the same personnel, right, the same guys involved in them as in 9/11, then this is another way of showing that the 9/11 attacks were a fraud. We've already got all kinds of ways of showing that they were a fraud, but this is an interesting angle. And it also suggests that this was one operation, not two. It was one operation with two parts. So that's when I decided to really get into it. I wrote an article, and then somebody said to me, that could actually be a small book. And so one thing led to another, and it became a book.
Now, I wonder if you could just recall, both from your own research and your own recollections of 15 years ago, what were the impacts of those anthrax letters at that time, coming right on top of the 9/11 terror attacks?
Well, the truth is that if I tried to put myself back to that time, I could barely remember them. The anthrax attacks were pretty big news in the U.S., a little bit less in Canada. And the scare was big for a while and then quickly went away. And you see, this is part of the story. Part of the story is that once it was found out that they didn't come from Islamic extremists and all the rest of that cooked up story, there was a tendency to, well, not just a tendency, I think it was a deliberate effort on the part of the FBI and other agencies to sweep the whole thing down the memory hole. And so there are many people today, including many Americans who were adults at the time, who barely remember them. Oh, yeah, something about anthrax in the mail. Because it didn't turn out right, did it? I mean, the story fell apart. It fell apart very rapidly. By the end of 2001, it was gone. It was in tatters. And so that turned out to be part of my mission and part of the point of the book, to remind people that, wait a minute, you can't forget about these, because they could be one of the major keys to unlock the door to the global war on terror.
Yes. Now, as you were pointing out in your opening remarks, the attacks seemed aimed at people. In this instance, they seem to be aimed at people who were in a position to expedite the passage of the PATRIOT Act, Tom Daschle and Leahy, through the Senate and the House of Representatives. But they also served propaganda functions of linking 9/11 with Iraq. So do you have any insights into whether one or the other was the prime motive, or is it impossible to kind of separate the two as motives?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I'm always reluctant to pretend to know more than I can actually prove. What is clear is that anthrax letters were sent to two senators, as you pointed out, both Democratic senators, and both after they had slowed down the passage of the Patriot Act. And this is not rocket science. I mean, Cheney said he wanted the act passed by October 5th, but it wasn't passed on October 5th because of two senators who slowed it down. Then, somewhere between October 6th and 9th, letters were put in the mail containing deadly anthrax to precisely those two senators, and only those two senators, right? So it's pretty obvious that it was an attempt to intimidate them, and indeed Congress more generally, which wasn't passing the Patriot Act as quick as the neoconservatives wanted them to. On the other hand, as you pointed out, there was far more going on than just intimidating Congress to pass the Patriot Act. One of the functions, I'm absolutely certain, of the anthrax attacks, just like 9/11, was to facilitate attacks on foreign nations. And by the middle of October, as you pointed out, the theory that was gaining momentum was what I call the double perpetrator hypothesis, which is that Al-Qaeda, had prepared the actual letters with their misspellings and their clumsy printing and all the, Allah is great, death to Israel, death to America, all that nonsense. And that, but that, Al-Qaeda wasn't sophisticated enough to make this stuff, this actual physical anthrax. And so that had come from Iraq. So they managed to try and frame, basically they managed to justify the invasion of both those countries, and it would have worked, except they made some big mistakes and the story fell apart.
Could you zero in on those big mistakes? I mean, you mentioned that tracing this particular strain of anthrax to Fort Detrick, there was clearly an intention, well, it seems like I'm following what you put in the book, that they wanted a sophisticated state apparatus so that they could somehow pin the blame on Iraq and thereby justify that invasion. But they used a strain that Iraq doesn't use and that's traceable to the United States. Why did they make that? I mean, is it really that difficult to see that this is going to fall apart? Was it just incompetence? What are your thoughts? Why?
Again, I would need to speculate, and there are different views on that in the small community of people who study the anthrax attacks. So, my view isn't necessarily the same as everyone else's. One thing was noticeable, and that is that when it was discovered it was the Ames strain of anthrax, people did not immediately conclude that it came from the United States. In fact, there were articles in major U.S. newspapers saying that that information was not helpful in pinning it down, because the Ames strain had become so common that it was all over the world and probably wouldn't help in narrowing it down. Now, that turned out not to be true, but it may be that the perpetrators were a bit sloppy there and thought they could pass it off. The other thing is, as you know, it wasn't just the strain of the anthrax that was used that turned out to be a fingerprint, it was also the weaponization process. Microencapsulation, especially in the case of the anthrax that went to the two senators. Um, and again, how could they have been so sloppy? Well, there was a major propaganda effort, we have to remember, in October, and to some extent beyond that, to make it look like the weaponization process was Iraqi. ABC News was especially complicit in this, and they said they had 4 high-level, separate, experts who said that there was bentonite on the anthrax spores, and that only Iraq used bentonite to weaponize its anthrax. And they were really pushing that story hard. But unfortunately for them, they seem to have allowed, some scientists seem to have got into the game here who weren't supposed to be in it. In other words, some genuine scientists actually got a look at the anthrax spores, or in some cases, they got a look at studies of the spores, and they kind of scratched their heads and said, there's no bentonite here. This isn't Iraqi, and it certainly isn't Al Qaeda. This looks like our stuff, you know. And I mean, even the armed forces, like the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, studied the spores, and put out a little report, which I have. It's quite brief, but it says, no, there's no bentonite here. So my guess is that the conspirators, and I don't mind using that term because that's what they were, who put this thing together, thought they could keep the circle fairly small and handle it. They had felt, well, we've got control of the media. We'll have ABC put out some baloney, you know, and we've got control of this and that. And so we don't need to read in all of these scientists and military people and so on who might, after all, not want to go along with this. And I think, you know, somewhere along the line they made a huge mistake there, because the whistle was blown on them to a large extent by people that you would think of as insiders.
Now, even if the official line at the end of the day was that Iraq could not have been responsible, it seems as if maybe the State Department was counting on that anthrax scare, like a certain maybe subliminal fear factor, because Colin Powell gave his presentation in front of the UN. He had that big flask of anthrax in his hand. This is in February of 2003. So is that maybe attempting to get some scraps from that initial episode?
Oh, absolutely. And I don't know if it was Powell's idea or not. He seems at that point to have been fairly passive and being bullied by the neocons. I mean, he nowadays says he was ashamed of his performance in the UN. Well, of course he should be ashamed. He's responsible for the death of huge numbers of people, and he lied his head off. So I'm not exonerating him. Nonetheless, there does seem to have been a genuine tension between some of the other guys in Powell. So yeah, he goes with this little script, and he holds up, you know, the thing and says, just a little bit of anthrax, the amount in this file shut down the whole Senate building in 2001. And of course, you know, he's trying to use this to scare people about Iraq. Now, by this point, he knows perfectly well, everybody knows Iraq had nothing to do with it. So he's careful not to say that Iraq did it. So it's classic propaganda. You hold up the vial, you make it concrete for people, you show them. You evoke the anthrax scare of 2001. You say you're sure that, you know, Iraq still has anthrax, and so on and so forth. And people get scared, they get confused. Now, of course, it was all lies. Iraq had nothing to do with the 2001 thing, but they also didn't have any anthrax stocks and hadn't had for years when he was making all this. And they didn't have methods of delivering them either. It was all a bunch of lies. So, but yeah, you're right. They certainly used it to the extent that they could as a propaganda method.
Now, talk about they're moving on to the lone wolf perpetrator scenarios. The first Stephen Hatfill and then Bruce Ivans, who apparently committed death by suicide by swallowing a lot of Tylenol. Now, why did the U.S. authorities move to that particular scenario? as their, what was it, damage control? What did it serve any other purposes other than to, as I say, just trying to move away from the failed Iraq implication there?
No, I think you've got it right. It's damage control. It's option B. It's what's sometimes called a limited hangout, where you allow certain parts of the truth to come out, but you continue to lie about essential parts. So what are you letting out? You're saying, oh gosh, it does seem this anthrax is our own. Seems like it came from our own, military industrial complex. In this case, they're saying it's from Fort Detrick, and Bruce Ivans was a scientist who worked there, and he had to have certain clearance and so on. And they're saying, damn it, it did come from in our inside. So they're admitting it's an inside job, though they don't use the term. They're admitting it's a false flag attack that was blamed on people who didn't do it, though they don't use that term either. But what are they hiding? Well, they're hiding what's rather obvious, and I argue for it in my book, and that is that it wasn't done by any individual, whether Bruce Ivans or anyone else. Everything about this says it was done by a sophisticated, widespread network of people, just like the 9/11 attacks. And that's what they're keen on hiding. And if you can make your lone wolf, which is the term they use, into a lone nut, so much the better, which is exactly what they tried to do with Ivan. So he was on medication, he was unstable, some of which is true, but it didn't mean he was the anthrax killer. I've seen never a smidgen of convincing evidence that Ivans had anything to do with the attacks. But, stress his instability and make him more unstable. Show up at work, harass his family, say you're going to seek the death penalty, and get the guy scared out of his mind, which is what they did. Whether he actually took his life because of all this stress, or whether someone just killed him as part of the operation, I frankly don't know. But either way, whether directly or indirectly, the FBI is responsible for that man's death.
And dead men tell no tales, so...
Exactly. I mean, they didn't have to have a trial. It's hard to imagine how they could have won if it went to court. I mean, they had nothing. So, as in so many of these incidents within the war on terror, the alleged perpetrator somehow dies and the court case is avoided. If you look in Canada recently, 2013, 2014, right? You find in 2013, the guys they set up, John Nuttall and Amanda Carodi, actually, are allowed to live. So there's a trial and the RCMP is disgraced. They're disgraced. It all falls apart. In 2014, on the attack on Parliament, the so-called terrorist takes 31 bullets, so there will be no trial.
I'm wondering, in the bit of time we have left, the efforts to link the architects of the anthrax deception with the 9/11 hijackers, with the architects of the 9/11 attacks. Could you, concretize that bridge for us?
Yes. Well, it's difficult to do without PowerPoint slides, but I give in my book several examples of how particular people that we know that are called the 19 hijackers. Okay, let's forget about the question for the moment as to whether they actually hijacked anything on September 11th, but they're called the hijackers. So several of them show up in the preparations for the anthrax attacks. So, for example, a woman named Gloria Irish turns out to be the real estate agent of the first man to die of anthrax. And she turns out to be the real estate agent of several of the 19 hijackers as well. Well, that's kind of weird. What are the odds of that? And as we begin to look into this, we see, for example, that the so-called leader of the hijackers, Mohammed Atta, is running around the place, making himself very visible, and trying to do things like get the U.S. Department of Agriculture to give him a crop duster plane. So that, and he says, I'm an engineer. I'm going to modify this so I can dust all these crops without having to re-land and refill. And then he threatens to cut the throat of the U.S. Department of Agriculture person who's interviewing him, and he makes all kinds of comments about Osama bin Laden, and the whole scenario is so absurd you just want to laugh. So this is obviously a guy who's, I don't know if he's really, his name is Mohammed Atta or what his name is, but he's running around acting a role, and he's laying down a trail of breadcrumbs that we're supposed to follow. And that trail is supposed to connect 9/11 and the Anthrax attacks. That's its aim. Because remember, Saddam Hussein was said to have to want to use crop duster planes, to spread his anthrax. So suddenly there's all this stuff about crop dusters, and these hijackers are running around trying to get crop duster planes. And you see, they were successful in laying down a trail of breadcrumbs, and the press and everybody was cheerfully following the trail until the whole story fell apart.
I just want to ask you one more question, if I may, Professor Macqueen. It's been almost 2 years since your book came out. I was wondering if you've seen any new revelations on the subject of the anthrax that may figure into the overall scenario with regard to 9/11.
Well, certainly. Not long after the book was published, we had a major whistleblower, Richard Lambert, who was for a time the head of the FBI's anthrax investigation, got into a serious conflict with the FBI when he left the agency and tried to get a job elsewhere, and they blackballed him. And he took them to court. And one of the things that he says, if you read it all, his document, is that one of the reasons he's being harassed is because he blew the whistle on the anthrax attacks. He says that his office was, in effect, set up to fail. He said there is, I think the term he used was, a wealth of exculpatory evidence. Now, there was a whole bunch of evidence showing that Bruce Ivans, the lone nut, which the FBI still officially calls the anthrax killer, shows that he was innocent. And there's evidence there, he said, that the public has never been shown, that the FBI is still sitting on. And really, when I read his thing, I thought, well, this just confirms everything I said in the book. And I suppose if I ever bring out another edition, I'd have to discuss that.
Professor Macqueen, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, you're quite welcome. It's been enjoyable.
We've been speaking with Professor Graeme Macqueen. He teaches at McMaster University in Hamilton, and the title of his 2014 book, again, is The 2001 Anthrax Deception, The Case for a Domestic Conspiracy, and it's published by Clarity Press.